Questions of Doom. Hello and welcome back to another Questions of Doom. In this series, as ever, I attempt to answer questions that you send my way using the archaeosoup@gmail.com email address, as displayed on the YouTube channel homepage, but as you'll also see at the end of this video. In answering these questions by video, it is my fond hope that the answer is not only useful to the person who's asked the question, but also anyone else out there who may be wondering the same thing. Now, this question of doom is actually the first in hopefully a batch over the next few weeks, where I'll be answering questions that I've been unable to answer until now. Basically, I've been just had no time to properly answer them. And so actually, this question actually came to me in December, I think, January, and it's a wonderful question, but also strangely, it was also recently modified as well. So it references something that recently happened, precisely because I took so long at answering the question that a better example turned up. So those of you who are waiting for Questions of Doom to be answered, worry not. I have skipped you, but I also haven't, you see, because this person was in the door first. Anyway, the question goes as follows. Dear Mr. Soup, thank you for taking the time to answer my question of doom. My question today has been modified, inspired by your recent trip to Ireland. Actually, it was Northern Ireland, as a point of fact. Mr. Soup would want me to insist. It looks like you had a good time away on your vacation. In particular, I really liked the photos you shared from the Ballyknoe Stone Circle, or Ballyknoe. Now, the Ballyknoe Stone Circle is a site that we did visit, and I shared an album on the Facebook page, but also actually it's a site that was recommended to me by some archaeological friends for a couple of reasons, which I'll get into in a moment. I know that oftentimes those places have been set up by landowners and farmers moving stones around, but it got me wondering, where can we see the same sites as our ancient ancestors? If not stone circles, is there any way to experience the same something as our ancient ancestors? So if not stone circles, is there something that we can see which is the same? Hopefully this question makes sense. Would love to know what you think and the what you and the Archaeosoupian viewers think. So that's you guys at home. Best wishes, Jason. And this is a question which I've been yearning to answer properly and actually you gave me the perfect sort of jumping off point when you modified your question to include our recent trip to Northern Ireland. Because you're right, stone circles on the face of it initially, before, in theory, you would think stone circles are the perfect place to share an experience with our ancient ancestors, with people from many thousands of years ago. These are places that they built, that we know that they went to, because obviously by definition you have to be there to build them, if nothing else. But also we have lots of evidence of, for example, feasting and gathering and general activity around these monuments. So if there's going to be something that we can almost, I suppose, commune with the ancient ones that we can sort of try and gain some commonality, common experience, then you would think stone circles would be a great place to start. But as you quite rightly hint, this idea of them being set up, as you say in your email, is one which is sort of unavoidable. Over the years, these sites have been managed because of their context, usually in farmland. And so from Castle Rig, my personal favourite stone circle, to Stonehenge, Ballyknoe, and all around these islands, stone circles are not really reliable one-to-one visions of their original intent, in so much as sometimes you'll have farmers moving the stones to make them more pleasing. The landowner wants them to look a bit better, as it were, so he'll slightly modify them, or perhaps there's a stone that's in the way because of mechanized, or even before mechanized ploughing, that stone is in the way of our horse, we'll put it with the stone circle. Obviously you have elements such as erosion. You have the way that the land is now actually in that sense used as well, because when we went to Ballyknoe we had this experience of walking essentially along a modern field boundary, a very straight line, then a corner, and then into the site, which was mediated very very strongly by a well-kept, fairly modern track through a sort of a tunnel of trees and shrubbery, and all the way along that pathway we were being bombarded. I certainly felt as I was being bombarded by lots of fairy memorabilia, so twinkly things and bells and little doors and plastic fairies, things like that, which immediately bias the site. And actually on the stone circle itself there was a tree growing up on the site, and that was just a whole it was like a shotgun of just fairiness, as it was, certainly modern fairiness. There was even a little shrine with coins, for example, in there. And that was interesting because it actually set off two thoughts for me. First of all, I was thinking, well, this is a sort of a form of appropriation of the site. People, this is what people do now with this site. But also, actually, as a Welsh boy, I was very uncomfortable with people invoking fairies. This sort of post Tinkerbell Disney idea of what a fairy is doesn't really sit with my understanding of what the traditional broader Celtic idea of what fairies are. So actually, I was talking with my lovely wife's mum, my mother-in-law, and we were talking about actually how both in Irish and also Welsh traditions, fairies are scary. They'll steal your baby and swap it out for a changeling, all this kind of thing. So in that sense, that was my second reaction, was one of just no, you don't invite fairies in. So all of that was clouding my experience of the stone circle, and without a doubt, from the placements to the fact that you had you could see where people walk, how they walk around the site today. The grass was subtly discoloured, for example. You could see how it had been maintained by recently mowed, for example. This kind of thing. The grass had been. None of it was authentic in that sense. None of it was actually ancient. Now that doesn't lessen the validity of visiting the site, or indeed excavating the site. There had been an excavation, I think, in the 1960s. But it does mean that what you're seeing now is not what people saw in the past, and that goes for, I would say, everywhere. All ancient places are different, either because of age, because of actual changes that have happened on the site, or simply just through accidents. They're not going to be the same. Now, this is actually a central problem for archaeology when it comes to phenomenology, but I'll come back to that at the end of this video. But it did get me thinking and wondering, what are the constants then? If you can't rely on especially, for example, things that have been made by people, or landscapes, for example. Britain, by many measures, huge swathes of what we call this green pleasant land, especially in southern England. It's actually ecologically relatively dead, just grass, whereas previously it had been forested and whole megafauna and all sorts of stuff. So you can't rely on that stuff. So what can we rely on in terms of looking at, say maybe Neolithic, Bronze Age, maybe Mesolithic even, this kind of thing. Stars. How about stars? Well, possibly. We know that for example, the Mayans, ancient Egyptians, people in ancient China made observations of stars which we can relate to. We can understand what they were talking about. We know which star systems that they're mentioning, which constellations. But they have also undeniably changed. In fact, one of the key first observations of ancient Chinese astronomy was the fact that the skies changed over time, and so within lifetimes they would go, oh, that star's moved, or this star has disappeared, or there's a new star, this kind of thing. So actually, you can't rely on the stars. How about human faces? Surely there's a universal commonality there. That after all, the human brain is hardwired to recognize faces. If you draw two dots on a piece of paper and some sort of squiggle underneath, doesn't really matter what shape that squiggle is, people will identify a face. They'll very quickly think, oh, that looks like a face. We are biologically drawn to look for faces and to recognize them. And so maybe there's something there. Maybe actually that's something that we can rely on, and that we've always had, is each other's faces. But there's a problem there, in so much as you have the problem of phenomenology, which again I'll come back to at the end of this video. But an aspect of that is actually cultural associations. So actually, what we think about when we look at each other's faces, how those faces now react to being looked at. You know, we have sort of, you know, camera smiles and cheeky performances that we put on in modern day life. If you look at famously, if you look at, for example, people coming out from the Berlin Wall, they didn't have that. They didn't have that sort of what's been called the Kodak smile. So actually, our faces are different now, even than they were 50 years ago, in terms of how we use our faces. But then actually, even beyond that, recently, or relatively recently, there was some research that showed that the first people who came into Europe with farming, they weren't, you know, white, as it were. They had a, what we call, what the research paper, I believe, called a swarthy appearance. So they weren't, certainly weren't, for example, as pale as Mrs. Soup. If I was to plonk someone who looked similar to Mrs. Soup in front of someone from 7 to 10,000 years ago, their reaction might be one of you know, familiarity, I suppose, but also mixed with surprise. This person is immensely pale. You know, they're practically translucent. What's going on? What's wrong with that person? They're practically translucent. So you can't even rely on human faces, because everything from how we use them to how they look actually has changed. Colours. How about colours? Colours and colour perception. Surely there's a biological imperative and there's a biological similarity in terms of how we see colours. And yes, that is true. But a bit like with human faces, while the brain is programmed to do certain things and to look at certain things in certain ways, and it's very important to our survival, for example, being able to identify a fresh berry from a rotten berry, or one that's not ripe yet, there is a problem, and the problem is, again, sort of actually cultural. And this boils down to the perception of colours, what you as a society distinguish between as colours. So there are groups in the world who don't distinguish between pink and red, for example. There have been famously actually conversations about whether or not the ancient Greeks could see blue. Now, of course they could see blue, naturally, because we can see blue. But because, for example, in Homer's writing, he describes the sea as being wine dark. There's some conversation about whether actually for them blue and red kind of merged together. And if you think about it, that kind of makes sense. You know, the sky blue is shades of blue into red throughout the day, and maybe there's something about what they would accept as being a different colour. I've talked in the past about, for example, in Old Norse, blue and black were very similar, if not indistinguishable verbally. So Harold Bluetooth actually had black teeth, for example. When they met people from North Africa, they called them blauer men, blue men, because they didn't verbally distinguish between those colours. And so while we can rely on the fact that they could see them, for them, they would, or rather, to have a conversation with someone from ancient times about colours might actually be almost impossible. They may not know what you're talking about when you talk about, say, the difference between purple and skin colour. For them, it's just one. That's just culturally one colour, you know. So it's really not that simple. And actually, when it comes, for example, to the ancient Greek idea of colour as well, is that often they didn't describe what a colour looked like, but rather its effect. So you know, the shimmering of something, or the in the case of the sea, the effect of the sea was that it was unctuous, like a deep crater of wine, or a deep glass of wine. That's what they were describing. And so in some ways, for some cultures, colour isn't even as important as you might think. It's not even that they don't distinguish between different colours, but they just don't use colours to describe things. So that's another problem. You see, colours, you can't rely on that. How about animals? Animals, we can all relate to animals. We've seen pictures of animals in cave paintings, for example, in Lascaux, the famous cave of the bowls, this kind of thing. Animals, surely we can look at a bison or a dog or something and see what they saw. But no, we can't. We can't, because an awful lot of the animals that we can relate to now are different, massively different from certainly animals in ancient times. I mean, there were things like aurochs and megafauna that just don't exist anymore. But beyond that, even just within a couple of 100 years, the shape of dogs changes dramatically. If you look at paintings from the 1700s and greyhound or something, what they thought a greyhound was and what we think a greyhound is not the same, because the animal has changed, and also breeders encourage different aspects of those animals. The same goes for farming. The same goes for wild species as well. They change too quickly, and so actually we couldn't have a familiar communal sort of experience when we're looking at animals with our ancient ancestors. It's really hard, isn't it? It's really difficult to actually think of something that we can look at and think, yes, that is exactly the same as the experience that Joe Bloggs would have had on the 15th of June 10,000 BC. And I was really struggling with this. And it's a timely thing, because only a few weeks ago I came across a potential answer. And this answer actually exists in the artwork of Hiroshi Sugimoto. Apologies if I'm butchering that name, but he's a Japanese artist, very much inspired by Japanese culture and philosophy, but also actually elements of European impressionism and the thinking behind how we relate to imagery. And actually he challenged himself with this very question. He was wondering how can he commune artistically with ancient people, and he initially looked inland to Japan and looked at the people, and then realized that actually no, maybe there is one thing. It's not the stars, not faces, not colors, not animals, nothing like that. The thing might be as simple as the seascape. And there's some wonderful photos that he took, which are basically equally top to bottom, as it were. They're sort of almost chopped in half by the horizon, with the water going out away from the camera and then sky above. And that there is something that is unchanged and unspoiled. If you ignore the possibility of coming across pollution and seeing a ship on the horizon, there's something pure and timeless about a seascape horizon. And actually that's actually incredibly pertinent as well, especially for example the European Neolithic Bronze Age, is that people were using the water and the sea for transport far more than they were using land. If you wanted to get from the Orkney to London, or the equivalent of London, to the southeast of England at the time, there's no way on earth you would walk. There's no you would sail around the whole island. People in the Bronze Age were travelling from the Middle East to Britain to get tin, for example. The seascape, travelling on the sea, being on the sea, the smell of the sea, the sound of the sea, that flat line horizon, uninterrupted by technology, is probably that thing. It's probably that something that you're searching for, Jason. It's probably that holy grail, as it were. So I was quite excited when I came across this artist, and I thought, yes, excellent, yes, that's really good. And then there were some similar things that I sort of went on to think about. For example, essentially what we're talking about is physical constraints. So I suppose with the result of basic physics and what's happening. So on the ocean, you've got gravity, you've got the atmosphere, you've got maybe the tides being affected by the moon, but that's something which doesn't change, and that's something which happened and happens. So little things like maybe looking at fire burning. Never mind what's behind the fire or what's causing it to burn, apart from gas flames, obviously. Fire, that's something which is a physical constant, a bit like that seascape horizon. Snowflakes, raindrops, this kind of thing. These are things which we can look at, and which they could look at as well many thousands of years ago. The sunrise and the sunset, potentially. But again, that is contentious because of the atmosphere, essentially, because the amount of, say, pollution and pollutants and particles in the atmosphere, that definitely has an effect on the colour gradient that we see in the morning and in the evening. But there's something pure there as well, and unchanged by human hands over the years. But ultimately, I'm sorry to say that all of this comes back to this, and as I hinted at the beginning of the video, this problem of individual experience, varied experience, the experience is mediated by our own bodies, i.e. phenomenology, how the world is revealed to us as we pass through it, is an entirely personal thing, and it's entirely connected to our own experiences. It's entirely connected to our own physicality, to our own, perhaps our own disabilities, to our own maybe blindness in one eye or something. It's also as well intimately connected to also how we view ourselves as the viewer. I've touched on in previous videos this idea of identity as being individual, dividual. Essentially the extent to which you identify yourself as one person or one of many people, as it were, in a group. That's where, again, we might hit a bit of a stumbling block, is that the purity of the ocean seascape might be mediated by how the viewer thinks of themselves in relation to that seascape. But that's where, I suppose that's where we're getting into the psychology of it, and it all gets extremely complicated. But I just wanted to mention, I wanted to acknowledge that, just in case someone goes, well, actually, there's no such thing as a pure experience. I know that, but I think we touched upon that holy grail of that thing, and that thing, I think, beautifully expressed in those photographs, is the seascape. So there you go. Hopefully, Jason, this has gone some way to answering your question, or certainly giving you some thought, my thoughts, as you requested. I've given you my thoughts, and I would encourage people below to comment and discuss and add to these thoughts, as Jason requested, but also, frankly, as I'm always curious myself, I want to see where the conversation goes. But thank you so much for the question, and for the opportunity to think, and finally be so elated when I came across some of this thinking behind those photographs. It's been an interesting one, so thank you very much. As ever, guys, until next time, do take care. Bye bye.
What's archaeology?
That's brilliant.